Welcome to the Historical Movies Podcast, a podcast all about movies inspired by history. I'm Ross Evans, I'm an editor, and I'm joined as ever by Professor of Modern History at Liverpool Hope University and historical scriptwriter, Bryce Evans. Bryce, how are you doing?
Very good, ready for this. I have my loincloth on and my jaguar tooth in position through my septum.
Yes, because in this episode, I am Jaguar Paw, and this is my forest. It's Apocalypto. Yes, so we're back with the wonderful Mel Gibson, directed this one in 2006. A visceral adventure that on the surface is just a chase movie set in the jungle, a bit like North by Northwest in Guatemala. But much like the jungle, Bryce, that serves as this movie's backdrop, if you look a bit deeper, it's full of darkness, foreboding, and it's full of unseen dangers and catastrophes that we as the audience are violently exposed to. I found this a very weird film, and I mean that in a very positive way. This is a very immersive, atmospheric movie, not least of all because they're using a reconstructed form of the Maya language, and all of the actors are either non-actors or unknown actors, at least to Western audiences. So, how did you get on with it?
Well, I have to say, talking about the language, I started to watch this without subtitles, but unfortunately my Yucatec is not up to scratch. It starts off in terms of our mission here, in terms of analysing historical movies, with the quote from Will Durant: "A great civilization is not conquered from without until it has destroyed itself from within." First thing to say here about Durant is that he was a historian, philosopher of civilizations, but he was preoccupied and he had a sort of lopsided focus on Western civilizations. And he didn't look at pre-Columban civilizations like the Maya, the subject of this movie. And this bleeds into, I think, some of the condescension and inaccuracy in this movie. I think from the start, we know, don't we, that it's a Mel Gibson joint. Because we have a graphic hunt scene, incredibly violent, where it culminates in a tapir's balls being served up. And then a whole skit on a young man who is not able to produce issue, and a whole skit of, "Come here, son, rub this on your broken willy." And it's not herbal Viagra, it's actually a Red Hot Chili Pepper cue, lots of blokey lols. Yeah. You know from the start this is a Mel Gibson joint. To answer your question, I did ask myself, is this going to be boring fight scene after boring fight scene? I think it's better than that. I think there's more than that. You've got, like you say, the primordial fear of the jungle, the creepy crawlies, the enslavement, the journey, the character arc of Jaguar Paw. As you said, I am Jaguar Paw. This is my first, and I'm not afraid. I recited that on my morning runs through the woods, I have to say.
I hope you weren't accosted by any slave-driving Mayans. Yes, well, I mean, a fine summary. Yeah, especially that hunting scene at the beginning. We knew, as you said, there's zero subtlety in this movie. And then we'll get into the history maybe in a little bit, but then we are in this kind of noble savage village where everyone's wearing loincloths, where they're raided by some slavers, taken off to the city. Our main character, Jaguar Paw, or JP as I like to call him, is saved by a solar eclipse, a la Prisoners of the Sun, the Tintin book. That's what I remember when I was looking.
Good Tintin reference. We didn't get Tintin in the Congo into our references for the Lumumba movie for very good reasons. Let's just leave it there.
And then there's that scene of British Bulldog. Do you ever play that at school, Bryce? Where you're in a playground, you've got to reach the other side of the playground, and there's two or three people trying to catch you. So there's a scene where the escape scene is basically a glorified game of British Bulldog, and Jaguar Paw manages to escape, at which point the second half of this movie is just a chase movie, essentially, until the end. Until Jaguar Paw goes full Rambo, and then the Spanish turn up just as a little twist at the end. So looking at the Maya, and we'll have to go into some of the history of this, I suppose what a good way to start the historical analysis of this movie, Bryce, would be to come back to the quote that you quoted, which I understand was written about the Roman Empire. So a great civilization is not conquered from without until it has destroyed itself from within. According to Mel Gibson, this movie, the setting of Apocalypto is merely the backdrop for a more universal story of exploring civilizations and what undermines them. However, this film, would you agree or disagree, is basically saying that the Maya were in some way responsible for their own demise, which at the point at which this movie is set is not true, as far as we can tell.
Not at the point which it is set. I think that's the big thing to point out here, isn't it? That you can argue with many civilizations and their fall, their collapse. Say the civilizations on Easter Island or the Mayans, etc., etc. There is internecine conflict and scarcity of resources and sort of destruction from within. But when this is set, which is the eve of, it was presumably the early 16th century, that's inaccurate for that time.
Yeah, so the Maya, it's interesting, this film, I basically look at this film and Mel Gibson films, history is Mel Gibson's playground, and he likes to move things around which aren't necessarily in the right order or in the right place, but kind of gives you a feeling of the era that you're in. And this film definitely accomplishes that, but I have the feeling it might be the point at which I at least finally say they've actually gone too far, because there is big problems with the depiction of the Maya in this film. Firstly, the sacrifice thing, where some archaeologists say they didn't do any, and some say they did some, but nothing like the scale we see, almost industrial scale we see in this movie. There's also some confusion as well. Like they meet a girl who's got smallpox. But then we see the conquistadors who brought the smallpox at the end of the movie. So is that the first contact, or are the Spanish already here? There's some things alluded to in that there's some natural disasters going on, that the crops are failing. And if you remember, JP runs through a dead maize crop at one point when he's escaping. But that, as far as we can tell, that wasn't happening at this point in Mayan history. And the real reason why this civilization collapsed in the next 100 years or so is because the Spanish turned up with germs and gunpowder, as they say, particularly smallpox. So this film I find very confusing because it's a kind of a hodgepodge of different historical things that don't necessarily make sense altogether. I mean, it gives a great immersive film. I really enjoyed watching this movie, but has it gone too far? Would you agree with me that Mel's gone over the top a little bit this time? Well, and not giving us a good representation of what the Maya were about.
We've discussed the, shall we say, liberties which Mel likes to take in regards to Braveheart, some big liberties there. Okay, let's come back to your first couple of criticisms. I've read a criticism of the girl with smallpox being one of the worst historical inaccuracies ever witnessed in a movie. It's actually my favourite scene because I think it's a very pretentious scene. Now, I can see why people say that that's glaringly anachronistic. However, I'm not completely sure in which year, if this film actually stipulates which year exactly it is set in. Does it at any point?
Yeah, I mean, it could just be that the Spanish have already turned up at some point.
Well, exactly. That's exactly my point, because smallpox comes, and this is what wipes out these brilliant civilizations, these pre-Columban civilizations. It's introduced in Mexico in 1519, and then it spreads from 1519 onwards in this part of Central America. So I see that criticism. I don't quite accept it, because conceivably, depending on what year this is actually set in, it could, considering where we are in Central America, have already started coming south, if you see what I mean, from Mexico. So I can allow, and people will know by this stage, even as a historian, I can allow some liberties and some artistic license with this kind of stuff. So I think, unless I missed it, conceivably we could be post 1519. It could have already started its spread from the conquistadors in Mexico down south, if you see what I mean. So I don't necessarily see that scene as anachronistic. To come back to the sacrifice issue, yes, this, I think, really where I agree with you here is on the question of scale. It's epic. We can allow for that. This is Hollywood. but it's utterly overblown.
Right.
Did the Maya, I think from what I've read, the Maya, I think it's pretty well established. They did occasionally practice human sacrifice. But this is the issue here. This is not on the right scale. When we see all the piles of bodies, this is on the Aztec scale.
Yeah.
And all these societies, to our modern mindset, had aspects of cruelty. I would say the Aztecs more so, personally. I know this is very subjective and a little bit reductive, that the Aztecs more perhaps cruel to our modern taste than the Incas or the Mayans. But as far as I do know, the Mayans did, yes, occasionally decapitate and rip out hearts. But it's not on the Aztec scale. And that's the problem here, because this is done on something which is probably even beyond the Aztec scale of human sacrifice. So that is a problem, I think, here. Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, well, there are some estimates of the Aztecs, ludicrously high, tens of thousands just for one temple. I think someone worked out that, I forget the exact temple it was, but they'd have, if the upper estimate is right, they'd have to be sacrificing 15 people a minute.
But this is the Mayans. Being built. But this is the Mayans. This is
exactly. And the point is that this is the wrong civilization we're talking about here. We should be talking about the Mayans. And the other point I should also mention is that there is a mention of natural disasters or something going wrong in civilization, and then there's a knowing look from the high priest when the eclipse happens. Of course, one thing that isn't shown in this movie is the incredible knowledge of the cosmos and the calendar system and the knowledge of how time works that the Mayan civilization would have had. And so that scene, it's said by Mel Gibson on the DVD commentary, I understand, is that it's like the priest knows that there's going to be an eclipse that day, and they're just doing it to appease the people underneath them. Okay, the eclipse has come, the god is satisfied with his blood sacrifice. Now, that's something I didn't get at all when I was watching this movie, because I was lost in the gore, in the visceral decapitation, the mass graves, that kind of bodies rolling down temples.
That's the point here. These are not astronomer priests.
Yeah.
These are sadists, effectively.
Yeah.
And that's the problem here. And I think leading into that, we have to be aware that, what is Mel's overall philosophy and telos here is probably the idea, with caveats, of the civilizing force of Christianity coming into these civilizations, with its respect for individual life and dignity, which is very different to those cultures. But if you look at those pre-Columban civilizations, they do have, and this is really quite an obvious point, they have many tremendous organizational benefits, which in some ways trump the individualism which Christianity puts a point upon. Some of these practices, which we see, sacrifice, of course, they're born of the harshness of life. They're born of the population pressures, the deforestation, the protein deficient corn diet, climate change, drought, all these things across that history. So, these sort of aspects of primitive societies, which the Mayans did practice, it's often a way of keeping the cosmos in balance, of course, and of reducing internecine conflict. And, of course, there's a big problem here with this notion of the sort of civilizing force of Christianity, because for all the relatively enlightened figures like Bartholomew de las Casas or Queen Isabella even, who were talking about the dignity and the respect afforded to these people, of course, these things were greedily ignored by the conquistadors. And so I suppose what I'm getting at here is that Mel's, how can I put it, Christian telos is sort of creeping in here, that these are inevitably savage societies. And I suppose that becomes a problem. And the reason I think it becomes a problem is this. I'm going to quote a guy, an archaeologist, David Friedel, who writes, and I quote, "Allegory and artistic freedom are all very well and good." And I think we've established that in this podcast. We don't mind a bit of artistic license.
Absolutely.
But he goes on to say, except, and I quote, "except when they slanderously misrepresent an entire civilization." So I suppose my question to you is Mel committing libel against an entire civilization here? Does he go too far?
He went too far. I think Mel's gone too far. It was fine when he was shagging the princess in the last one we did. We know that's nonsense. It was fine when he was getting, Australian blood and the British royal bloodline. That's fine. But, they're individuals in some ways as well. But I think I would very much agree with the quote you just read out about civilizations. That leads me on to my next question. What does it mean when the conquistadors turn up at the end? Do you think... I mean, I've read people... Or I shouldn't say that. What I've read is some people think that it's like this completely overt Christianity is saving the savages. I haven't actually read anyone directly say that, because that's not what I got at all from the ending of this movie. But it sounds like you might have had a different experience.
No, that's not what I get from the movie, but I get it from... I think in some ways Mel Gibson's worldview. Christianity is a civilizing force worldwide in terms of its emphasis on the dignity of the individual. However, we've got to ask ourselves, and looking at his back catalogue, Passion of the Christ, etc., it's not in the movie, but is that creeping into the way he represents a culture and a civilization? And I would say it probably is. Having, travelled a lot in Latin America, and when you talk to people who... even people of those countries who would defend the colonization, they would couch it in those terms. That okay, it was regrettable. It was a lot of abuses, a lot of human rights abuses and racism that it spawned, horrific, but that it actually had the effect of being a civilizational force. And although I don't think the movie makes that point, I think that's probably Mel's mindset from what I know of the man. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that, but I think we've probably got to be aware of that as a leitmotif, perhaps creeping into all of this.
Yeah, maybe the point is it's not as over the top. I mean, this is a Mel Gibson movie, so it wouldn't be surprising if it was unsubtle and over the top. But maybe it's not as over the top as, there's literally the Christianizing force of good has just arrived on the beaches.
Well, maybe it just speaks, in terms of the title as well, it just speaks to the fear of apocalypse, when it's made climate change, the notion of an imminent disaster. Maybe it's just to defend Mel. Maybe it's just playing to a universal thing. That's why my favourite scene, I know we'll get to favourite scene, is the little girl with smallpox, because it does prefigure the absolute catastrophe which is about to happen here. And I suppose that universal fear of sort of impending wipeout, which is maybe, to be fair to Mel, it is a universal theme, which, is common to all humanity.
Yeah, I should also say that although I don't like the depiction of the Maya, just because I really think that an awful lot of people will get an impression of what the Maya... So I'm not saying I'm an expert, by the way, but a lot of people will get the impression of what the Maya civilization are like from a movie like this. That's not always necessarily a bad thing, because I think I'm not so conservative to say that if you're interested in something, you'll look it up. Yeah. So if you're interested by Apocalypto, you're likely to go and research what the civilization was like, and there's an awful lot of information. I should also make the point that part of the reason why we're not sure what the civilization was to a large extent is because the Spanish completely destroyed their culture by destroying every single piece of written work that they produced, apart from 4.
Yes,
there's only 4 left.
Overzealous Bishop Diego de Landa and his Inquisition against what they saw as Mayan idolatry, and of course they destroy all the written records. So, I mean, I suppose that perhaps does it bring us on to the... I mean, we don't get hung up on inaccuracies pedantically, perhaps, in this podcast, but I mean, surely it's incumbent upon us to perhaps segue into those inaccuracies. I mean, we've talked about the level of the savagery, the level of the human sacrifice. It's more Aztec in scale, but
yeah.
Some of the stuff you've already mentioned before, that was for its time and place, very advanced civilization, really quite good at grappling with hostile environmental conditions, building cities of great magnitude, and quite dense population, a writing system, advanced mathematics, astronomy, literature, Yeah, the list
Coco.
the list goes on, doesn't it? Yeah.
The number 0.
Yeah.
Yeah, these are all the then, and there's also I will spend a moment in a second to balance that. I do like this movie, but there's also this thing where this is a great movie for bum cheeks and thongs as well. If you notice that a lot of the Maya of this sort of noble savage tribe that we're interested in look like those images of lost tribes in the Amazon rainforest. But I mean, there's no mention of, I think maybe when they go to the main city, you see people wearing a few more bits of clothing. We never really see men. It's thought that they would wear cotton sleeveless shirts. The women had a hoipel. I'm not sure how to pronounce that word. It's a loose-fitting tunic, which is still within the Maya culture today, or a traje or traje, which reached to the floor. It's everyone's sort of dressed a bit like the kind of savages that you see boiling in a pot. Yeah,
well.
So that's another issue.
Bum cheeks and thongs. I mean, I'm pleased that it fulfilled your need for that. Having we've just had the Olympics and the beach volleyball, which obviously hasn't sated your need for that. But did you notice while we're on the subject of costumes, and we've discussed in this podcast before some of the great howlers, like the Zulu with the wristwatch, famously, perhaps apocryphal. Did you see here that of all the decorations and dangly bits on their noses and lips and ears, did you see the famous scene where there is a man with a cardboard magic tree, one of those deodorizers for your cars, hanging off his ear? Did you see that?
No, I didn't. That's not true, is it?
He
smelled like a pine forest.
Well, it's dangling off one of the tribesmen's ears, apparently.
I didn't see that. I do know that, bizarrely, in the teaser trailer for this movie before it was released, Mel Gibson himself appears for one single frame in a montage. You can look it up online. He's smiling, smoking a cigar with a beard in the teaser trailer to this movie.
Oh, good old
Maybe
Mel.
that kind of, yeah, he likes a laugh, doesn't he? Except if you're Jewish. No, but my point is that maybe that's Mel's view on history. It's kind of his playground. Which I should also now make the point that what this movie does really well, the immersiveness, which is not usually a word that you use so much with movies, but you're completely immersed in this world. Like the jungle as a character, the fact that you're seeing new faces with a new language, it completely transforms you to this world, and I really enjoyed that about this movie. Also, I quite actually enjoyed how visceral this was. I don't really. Maybe you could argue that the violence goes over the top, but I think it's kind of in keeping with the whole film, the whole of mood of the film.
I'm a great fan of nature doing the work, as I've mentioned on this pod before, and I think the scenes with the wife down the hole. And the sun and the rain start flooding the cave. Geologically accurate, of course, that part of the world is full of lots of caves, but also perhaps presaging the modern vogue for women and wanting water births, maybe. But that alone, which is probably letting the nature do the work, letting the natural environment do the work. I'm a big fan of that in historical movies, so that's a tick from me for sure.
Yeah. Well, I've got a question. I mean, obviously the answer is because the plot needs to happen, but why doesn't JP just hide his wife and child in the jungle that's 2 meters behind the massive hole in the ground? They can just go and hide in there, can't they? Anyway, the rest of the film would be slightly less interesting, probably. Because this is practically the only representation in Hollywood and or Western media of the Maya, do you think this movie has a special responsibility to represent them fairly, even if it's at the cost of entertainment?
No, I don't. I've made this point before. I don't think that art need necessarily resemble life, and I don't think. I mean, if you're looking to Mel Gibson to, represent you, I mean, I think I would probably more tend to agree with what you said earlier in terms of if this film prods people to say, oh, I might just look up the Maya and then discover how actually relatively brilliant their civilization was, then that's fair enough for me. I don't think that if Hollywood has a responsibility to represent everything accurately or underrepresented groups accurately. Well, it's if it provokes people to look it up, perhaps that's enough for me, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I'm a big believer that is actually how most people gain knowledge about things. I think that if you spark their interest, then they'll go away and be interested in that. And I don't believe that everything has to be historically accurate. Otherwise, you throw it out with the rest of the history books you disagree with or whatever. A few other notes I wrote down while I was watching this. Again, the snapping off the tip of arrows when you get shot with one is come back, as in Braveheart. Still not sure whether that is a good piece of medical advice. Mel Gibson turned down the role in World Trade Center, which is a movie about the World Trade Center. Turned down the lead role to direct this film. Good choice, I think. And did you know, Bryce, during the waterfall scene, when they were filming that, a cow fell over the edge and miraculously survived and was pulled out by a local man.
Well, isn't that nice?
And I've also got a hot take for you. My hot take is that this movie owes more to Mad Max than any other movie. We talked about it's like a chase movie. Well, I don't know if there are fans of Mad Max listening to this podcast, but that's basically, Matt, you just described the last half of the Mad Max The Road Warrior. It's a chase movie. Plus, when they get to the Maya town, that is basically like shot for shot the same as Bartertown in the third Mad Max movie.
I'm not familiar, I'm afraid, with the Mad Max canon, but I will take your word for it there. Okay.
Well, it won't be appearing on the podcast unless we time travel into the future.
Okay.
Okay, let's get on to our... Oh, one other thing I wanted to say. I don't know if you noticed the point where the main baddie, Zero Wolf, at one point he's almost crushed by a tree when he's walking past. And he says, "I'm walking here," as in the style of... a
New Yorker.
Yeah, I'm walking here. But famously from Midnight Cowboy, Dustin Hoffman's character. So our questions, Bryce.
Yes.
I'm asking questions here. Your favourite scene? I think you've told me that already.
It's the prophetic, scabby-faced little girl with the sickness who they push away with sticks.
Yes.
Because of that prefiguring of the apocalypse. And like I said before, I don't buy the criticism that that's necessarily anachronistic. So that's probably my favourite scene. Or... maybe just the Squid Game scene where they all have to run and that, and then they get all spears and rocks thrown at them, and the finisher finishes him off with his big stick by bashing all their brains out all over the place, and there's loads of brains left all over the floor.
That's your kind of level. Yeah, I think Squid Game is probably a better reference than British Bulldog. If you didn't go to primary school in England, you won't know what I'm talking about. Right, so my favourite scene was when the conquistadors turn up at the end, because I didn't know, I wasn't expecting it, didn't know it was going to happen. And there's that long panning reveal shot that swings around JP, and then we see these conquistadors arriving, and you think, well, he's had a bad time, and now these guys have turned up.
And they look really grizzled and grumpy, don't they, the conquistadors?
Yeah, it was also a moment, if this was directed by M. Night Shyamalan, it turns out that they were all inside a conquistador enclosure anyway for the last 100 years.
Well, thank goodness this wasn't directed by M. Night Shyamalan, because that would have really stretched the limits of already credulity at its limits here. But yeah, yes. So that's our favourite scene.
Your performance?
Favourite performance, I think the I'm afraid I've forgotten her name in the movie, but the wife partner of Jaguar Paw. I think she does a great job of not only fending off wild animals and hostile tribesmen in the cave, but looking after a toddler and giving birth, which I think is quite
full birth.
World's feat.
First ever.
What's her name?
Dalia Hernandez plays Seven. Her name is Seven.
Seven, yeah. I'm going to go for Seven. Yeah. Oh, although I do like, there's some nice recalls here. The guy who they were all joshing with and rubbing chili peppers into his balls, and then he's told he's useless by his old bat of a mother. But then when they're enslaved, she's the one who's useless.
Yes, I didn't notice that. I did have the mother. I think it's the mother-in-law. I did have the mother-in-law as my least favourite performance, especially when he comes back to the village and she's like beating him with a stick.
Well,
It's
again,
just-
the crushing...
It's like a carry-on film or something.
The crushing unsubtlety of Mel Gibson joints there, the sort of predictable Willie and mother-in-law jokes and
Violent
ultra-violent.
unsubtlety.
Yeah.
I went Rudy Youngblood, who's the guy who plays the main character, Jaguar Poor. Which historical figure should do the DVD commentary?
Well, I didn't really have anything for this one, but that's not the end of the world. Do you get my joke there?
Yeah, I want to hear what the Maya priest,
The Mayan end of the world,
and the. Well, I want to know from the elites on top of the pyramid what the hell is going on in the rest of the Maya kingdom right now. Is it because the Spanish arrived? Is there some drought that's been lost to history?
But you get my joke there. Allegedly the Mayan end of the world was going to be in 2012. So I didn't get this. I didn't respond to your request there, but that's not the end of the world.
Yeah, I got the joke. I just moved on.
Oh,
yeah, I just moved on.
Thanks, yeah.
So marks out of 10, Bryce.
Oh, we're going to marks out of 10 already?
Yeah, as we always do. They're always in the same order.
Because we've got some other questions to address as well, yeah?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm gonna... Yeah, look, I'm not in the Mel Gibson Appreciation Society. On the other hand, quite an effort here. He wrote, produced and directed this. Is this, as USA Today claims, a, quote, Mesoamerican Rambo? No, I actually think there's more. I think there's more to this movie. And I enjoyed this movie. And I enjoyed it unashamedly, despite the many inaccuracies. I'm going to give it a 7.
Yeah, so I also, much like Jaguar Poor's wife, am a 7 on this. But marks deducted. I really like this movie, but I've got to deduct marks for the history, which is not something I ever thought I would say on this podcast. But Mel went too far. So what makes it into our Hall of Fame?
Well, I think it's got to be the magic tree, the cardboard magic tree car deodorizer hanging off one of the extras.
That actually? I can't tell if you're joking or whether that's... Well, I only say that because Mel Gibson appears for one frame in the teaser trailer. I thought maybe he's put it in. Maybe
well,
he thought it would be funny.
I didn't see that, but it's got to be the magic tree for me. How about yourself?
Zero Wolf's obsidian blade of the main baddie, his dagger.
No, it's pretty...
Obsidian, amazing, sharper than modern steel, and still cuts people when they dig it up to this day. And beautiful. I've got some... actually, there was one question, Bryce. I've got a new question here.
Go on.
And the body count of this movie is 114.
So
my question for you...
That's way too low. It's got to be more than that.
I'm reading... I've got that from IMDb.
Yeah, but what about when we scan to the back of the pyramid and there's literally thousands of corpses?
I think what it means is people who are killed during the movie.
I still think that's on the low side, Anyway, yeah.
It did seem low to me. Anyway, so body count 114. My question to you is, which exotic method of death would you prefer? Here are the nominations. Bitten in the neck by a snake. Bitten in the head by a jaguar. Shot with frog poison. Impaled on a hunting trap. Or having your heart extracted and then decapitated.
Okay, so I can't choose having to run to the corn and the thwacker to thwack me.
No.
Which they do
it's
in
not
the Squid
exotic
Game,
enough. It's not exotic enough.
I'll probably, I'll probably go with the snake. But when that happens to one of the pursuers towards the end, his death is relatively quick. So I'd probably go for that one.
He does speed it up though by cutting open his veins, but lovely. Yes.
There's not a lot of compassion from his fellows as well, is there? They're just like, you're screwed.
No, well, as you said, a quite sadistic portrayal of a Mayan tribe or whatever they're supposed to be, but quite brutally sadistic.
Mel wanted, did you hear that on that? Mel wanted, and then talking about huge anachronisms here, Mel wanted talking about the sadism or will I go as far as to say proto-fascism of Mayan society in the way it's depicted here? Mel wanted the sacrifice scenes, the leaders to be quote, Mussolini-esque.
Is that right? I haven't read that. That's incredible. What does that? I don't really understand what that means.
Well,
with a funny little tea cozy hat and standing on a balcony.
We could be here all night. Performative cruelty. Perhaps.
I see.
Yeah,
I like that kind of that kind of operatic kind of performance that you get from fascist dictators.
Yes, yeah, and look, a kind reviewer would say, maybe can we forgive Mel lapsing into the Aztecs because that scene of the sacrifice, it has to be dramatic and horrible, and on an epic scale, perhaps. Anyway, sorry, let's move on. Go on.
The Nobel Prize for Movie Physics. I think there's some questionable impalings in this movie. I don't think the physics actually bears out. Like the tapir at the beginning gets so comprehensively impaled by the wooden trap. There's a guy who gets shot through the head with an arrow that comes out of his mouth. Is that possible? And some rapid butchery. I mean, how quickly can you take the organs out of a tapir or the heart out of a man?
Well, since we're on to tapirs, I've actually got a special, leading on from this segment, pedantry corner devoted to tapirs. Because if you read a lot of criticism of this movie, it struck me that an unbelievable amount of criticism related to the tapir. And I couldn't quite understand this, because we know that at least, talking about Mel and his little naughtiness in historical movies, at least it is a tapir, which is half the problem for the Maya. Because they don't have beasts of burden like the llama that the Incas have, of course. So at least it is a tapir. But you wouldn't believe the amount of criticism focusing on the tapir. The History Buff's YouTube channel, that fella, queering the sound the tapir makes. Oh, come on. I'll give you another example. James J. Amers and Elizabeth Graham, academics, writing in Latin American Antiquity Journal 2007, and I quote, "The dense bush of the tapir hunt is an odd choice, since tapir is rarely found in middens." Well, come on, lads. I mean, seriously. Anyway, I thought a midden was you'd know this as someone from an archaeological background. I thought a midden was an ancient rubbish dump.
It is, as far as I'm aware.
So they have an issue also. There's lots of criticism around the tapir. A lot of pedantry, I think, unjustified pedantry.
Tapir pedantry for this week's pedantry corner. What would happen in the sequel if there was one? Now, this, I actually think that the sequel, I don't know about you, I actually think the sequel, if you took it to mean the conquistadors arriving, for me, makes a more interesting setting than the setting of this film.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, the Mayans did, again, if people watch this movie, they probably don't get the sense that, you'd probably think, that's it then for the Mayans. Well, they did fight, I believe, sort of 200-year guerrilla resistance to the conquistadors. So, yeah, that might be a good sequel. I actually thought that a sequel would be... Are you familiar with the HBO, I think it's HBO series, Mayans MC? Are you
I don't
familiar
even
with
know
this?
what I've in researching this, I came across it. I don't even know what it is. What is it? Anything to do with the Maya?
Well, fast forward 600 years, and the descendants of Jaguarport, etc., are a biker gang selling meth and sporting lots of facial hair and even more tattoos. It's about a biker gang. So that would probably be the sequel.
A Maya biker gang.
Yeah, loosely. They're sort of Guatemalan, American. So yeah, that's really the sequel. 600 years on, they've become a biker gang selling meth, and still quite violent. I have to say, they're still quite violent bunch. But
actually, I did actually skip over a question, which would be best companion film, and I found one called The Ruins. I was looking basically for other films about the Maya, of which there are almost none.
Go on.
Which is coming back to my point about, does this have a special responsibility? The Ruins, 2008. The story follows a pair of couples on vacation in Mexico who visit a remote Mayan ruin that unfortunately is inhabited by carnivorous vine growth. So
they don't just see it, take a few pictures, and then go back to their hotel? No.
No, it's a horror movie, so I presume they will get killed by vine growth.
That's quite interesting. Not creepy crawlies, not savages, but vines.
Not ghosts, nothing.
Not ghosties.
I think, understandably, it was a box office flop because
you don't say.
Not since Day of the Triffids have we seen the fact that plants are not particularly cinematic. They're not particularly good baddies in films. Yeah. I think we've pretty much covered everything. Only to say that we should mention if there was a sequel, maybe we see Jaguar Paw and his family living an idealistic life in the jungle. I don't know. And we should say that around 90% of the Maya were killed, mainly by smallpox and other diseases, after the Spanish conquistadors arrived. So maybe the sequel would be even bleaker than this movie is. Right, so that was Apocalypto. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Historical Movies Podcast.